Okay, so this is going to be another shorter film. I'm going to go over some of the vocab that we'll be using to talk about ancient art, and some of the sort of underlying conceptual work that we do and what it's based on. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about chronology. And I'll be saying more about chronology at the beginning of the Egyptian lecture as well. So, all right, let's get right to it. So this vocab list these are the words I'll be talking about in the next bit of the lecture. Um, so here we go. All right, so I'm going to go back to the mosaic to talk about content and form. So the art historical terms that I'm giving you derive, at least as recently from 19th century German scholarship. And they're very interested in classification, divisions, and so forth. So you might see some of that kind of coming out or something to think about. So the content of our works, sort of simply put, is what is it depicting? So what does it represent? So in the case here, our mosaic represents the Tower of Babel. So that's sort of its contents. The form is how the artist goes about representing it. So it's everything visual, but also material. So we'll focus on the visual for a second. So I did a little description in the last video about the tower that you see, the brickwork. So the colors that are used, all of these things are part of the form, shapes, shapes the bodies, and so forth. The other part of form, which is what gets into what I would call the more scientific aspect of talking about art and thinking about art, is description. So this is where you are communicating what you see to someone else. And this is where the work of the art historian really is, because, forms can say the same over a long period of time. They can change, and describing those changes and what we see helps us understand artists, culture, cultural exchange. So if two styles are being shared, that sort of thing. So just to give you a sort of a sense of what I'm talking about there, this particular period of art is seen as being somewhat abstract or stylized. So the forms aren't super realistic. I'm going to have a slide on this in a second, but for right now, if you think of a photograph as the most realistic representation of a thing, and then you look closely at so say you have a photograph of people, and then you look closely at our people here, they are kind of summary. You get a little sense of like light hitting skin color and so forth, but there's not a lot of variation or realism here. So it's really a kind of basic, and something that might be even more basic or abstract would be like stick figures. In this methodology that like I was taught as part of my PhD, which I'm giving to you, there's sort of two poles that are seen in some ways, and if they're effective, everything's subjective to me. That's something you'll learn from my teaching. So the one pole is naturalism or realism. So like the closest the work of art can get to the thing in reality. And then the farthest would be abstraction. So we'll get back to that in a second. So style is something you'll hear me talking about a lot with respect to this video. So style refers to the level of naturalism or abstraction. So it's really hard to define, but I have a definition from one of the textbooks I've used where Mark Stansbury O'Donnell, who focuses on Greek art and narrative, he writes that style is, quote, a system of renderings used to form the details of a subject and a set of forms and shapes used to fashion an object. So again, this is the how, basically. If I think clothing fashion is always a good sort of illustration of this. So if you think of pants, as just the category of clothing, and then you think of all the different variations one could have of that in terms of material and color and cut and so forth. So that gives you a sense of style. A medium is the stuff that the style is realized through. And this is coming out of sort of even more work, earlier work, thinking about art in medieval Europe, for example, and even ancient Roman writings on art. And that's actually where the word medium is coming from, Latin. So Merriam-Webster definition here: a material or technical means of artistic expression, such as paint and canvas, sculptural stone, or literary or musical form. So it's really the cool part in a way is the medium, because this is the material that allows someone's imagination to come into being, essentially. So sometimes you might have heard too in the past a medium as painting or medium as stone and sculpture, and all of that's fine. When I'm talking about medium and what you'll be reproducing on examinations will be the actual material used. So we'll see, for example, granite or limestone sculptures in ancient Egypt. So you'll want to be able to identify, or you will be able to identify those mediums. And I tend to use pigment rather than painting. And this is in an effort to take away some of the cultural touchstones of the word painting. So if you think of painting, you might immediately have a painting in mind, like a painting on canvas, which is fine, obviously. But when we're talking about medium, the medium is really actually the pigment. So it could be oil or acrylic or fresco, mineral pigments, as we'll see later. Okay, so this is my coworker at home, Remy. So he's going to help me illustrate this idea of two poles, naturalistic to abstract. And actually, I just realized that I can even illustrate this better than I usually do in my classes, because I have Remy himself here. So, hang on a second. Remy, okay, you're going to do art. You're teaching. So this is Remy. Okay, good boy. Okay, you're done. So that's my dog. So he is an actual being that exists. If I'm trying to represent him and make an artwork of him, the most realistic thing that I could do potentially is to take a photograph. So number one on our little scale of naturalism is the photograph of Remy. So it gives you a sense that even if you hadn't just seen him on the video, or you're seeing him on the video, it gives you a sense of what he looks like, his color, fur, and so forth. So if we're going sort of down towards abstraction, and technically all art is abstraction, but it gets, let's not go there yet. It's so interesting though. Sort of the height of naturalism, and again, this you can see where the genealogy of German methodology is coming in here. So the height of naturalism is really seen as oil painting, and particularly European oil painting from, say, the 15th century through 19th or so. So this is painting that really strove to try to capture all of the little details. So this painting of a dog, you can see the sort of soft fur coming off of him. You get a sense for like his three-dimensionality. His eyes are sort of half open the way a dog's actually are. So all of these things give you this naturalistic or picture that's based in nature, but still an abstraction. And also a highly idealized and stylized one, but that'll be for a larger discussion. So going down on the abstract category, about midway through, this is a child's rattle from ancient Rome depicting a dog. Part of the reason I picked it was I thought it looked a little like Remy, or reminded me of Remy. This is more stylized, as you can see. So there's a little bit of texture to try to show some hair, maybe. You get a sense for like little ears and the curly tail, and sort of how it's walking. Although if I'm not telling you it's a dog, you might say fox or wolf, or give it some other identification, so it's not as realistic, basically. So somewhat realistic, not super realistic, which was appropriate for a child's rattle. Or not, the artist isn't worried about fidelity to nature per se. Side note to this, the ideal of naturalism, particularly in European painting, stems in part from reading texts about ancient art in Greece and Rome. So they're very obsessed with this idea of making something look realistic, and the European tradition took that on and inherited it in some ways. All right, so 4 and 5 I picked as more abstract. You know, in a way, this gets even sort of more subjective as to what you think is abstracted. But I just wanted to pick some pictures of dogs by artists I like. So you have Basquiat's dog at the bottom, Picasso's up at the top. And I would say really the scale part is just totally subjective, but you see how both of them, so you've got the 4 legs for a dog, you have maybe sort of perky ears, but then with Basquiat, you have lots of interest in color and texture and movement going on, or in Picasso, I would say shape and form, and things are more reduced. And this we think of maybe today as more modern, and that's all totally fine, contemporary art. Now, the most abstract, especially in English, Vol on our scale of talking about dog, is the word itself. So the word dog represents dog or means dog, but it doesn't actually look anything like a dog. And from what I understand of ancient, not ancient, sorry, but other languages like Chinese might have, there's actually some visual basis for that. Or Egyptian hieroglyphs, there's some basis for symbols in visual culture. With our script, there's nothing. So the word dog doesn't look like dog, but we all know what it means because you're versed in the language. Okay, so that's our methodology section. So in trying to understand ancient art, one of the stories that we tell, or that our historians commonly tell, is to do it in order, chronology. So try to figure out when something was created, and then get into the whys. So with respect to objects, this is actually quite tricky in antiquity. So first of all, what is it? So chronology is wanting a sequence of events for an object. So wanting to know when something is created or made. So the why is an important part is really more up to your research question. So it might be important to you to know, you know, when did Egyptian art go back to normal after the pharaoh Akhenaten came along? So you're going to look closely at works of art from that particular period to try to connect to them with a particular idea. Something else that could be important, thinking back to materials, and the last video I mentioned, particularly Egypt as a sort of crossroads. Trade tells us a lot about contact between peoples and economy and so forth. So if you start seeing lapis lazuli in Egypt, that tells you, and you can date when that happens, that tells you something about who they have contact with, because lapis does not come from Egypt, but one source is Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan. So having that, you know, helps you place the history of people, and you know, think of your own questions, or you will think of your own questions, and those are part of chronology. So when it comes to material culture, this is where things get potentially really frustrating or interesting. It's hard, very hard actually, to determine chronology potentially, or it's taken a lot of work, and it takes a lot of people working together over time to build chronologies, such as the ones that we have now for the material that I'm talking about. So the thing that we would like to have as historians is something called absolute chronology. And this is the association of a particular object with a calendar date. So think about today, if you were an artist creating a piece, you're probably going to put the date on it in your signature, unless you have some reasons for not doing so. This is just something that artists and we do today, because chronology is a big part of just our thinking about the world, period. So it's important. Who made it is important today. This is not the case in antiquity. So as we'll see, starting with Egypt, the main reason that the artists are producing art is for religious, spiritual purposes, and they're not worried about it being a history potentially, or a history in the way that I'm talking about it here. It's really more the meanings have different value. So having a date on something is just like, you know, and also at that point, like there, you know, who was imagining that there would be as many pharaohs as there were, and you know, occupations and so forth. So today, with some more history behind us, chronology becomes particularly more important. What we have more often for ancient objects, things that are rediscovered in the field, is something called relative chronology. And so this is defining objects by their relationships to one another, often visually. This is also part of why the formal analysis, when I was talking about form, is scientific, because form is one of the ways that we can work to find chronology and temporal relationships, which then allow us to build a history. This is also where things get interesting, because this is where debate can happen, or a new rediscovery blows apart previously thought notions about art. And I'm going to show you one of those in a couple of videos. An agate that was rediscovered in 2015, so really sort of changed ideas about Minoan art. But anyway, I digress. To get actually go back for a second. To get an object with a relative chronology, ultimately what you're doing is comparing it back to some objects that have absolute chronology for whatever reason. And so some of these could be a structure. So in Greece, the Parthenon, we know the dates that it was built because those are recorded in histories. So that is an absolute chronology, or an example of a monument with an absolute chronology. Another example, actually from some of the late Greek world, something called the Alexander sarcophagus, because it depicts, or probably depicts, Alexander of Macedon. And originally it was actually thought to be potentially his, but it belonged to a Syrian king. So we can date this sarcophagus because we know who it was for, Abdolanimus, and we know that he becomes regent, or he's appointed by Alexander as a ruler after a battle in 333. We know also from histories the king dies a couple of decades later, so this means that his sarcophagus has to date after Issus in 333, but then can't go past 20 years later. So we have a date of this about 320, 310 BCE. So this means that someone finding a work in the field or museums, because a lot of works in museums are unprovenanced, one of the ways to try to think about date or get some historical context for an object would be to use this object and make comparisons and say material is similar. So another example, it's really not until after Alexander that you see marble being used as a material in Egypt for works of art. And this is because you have elite Greek patrons who are living there, and marble is what they're familiar with, so they're purchasing marble. So that's why you don't see it before then. Okay, digressing. So more often, this is what we have, relative chronology. Just a couple other examples. So the Riace warriors, we'll talk more about when we get to 5th century Greece. There are two bronze statues of soldiers or warriors. The type of bronze, and bronze experts identified them as having been made in Greece, but they were in a ship that crashed. So they were being brought away from their original context to an art market, essentially, or potentially for religious, but really more private ownership purposes. The way that they look, their style, so the musculature, their stance, the length of their hair and facial hair, all of this helps experts date them to the 5th century BCE. As we'll see when we start looking at Greek art, the earliest Greek art is heavily indebted to ancient Egypt. So it's really not until the 5th century that you stop seeing motifs that are very Egyptian. So that helps us with, okay, this is 5th century BCE. And of course, you know, new discoveries could always change that particular picture. So something to keep in mind if I'm talking about something and it seems fishy, or you have your own questions. All right, so to conclude, when we're doing this relative chronology and building it and thinking about change over time, there's sort of two ways to approach it. And one is to look at those changes over a large amount of time, potentially also geography. So this is just one topic that I picked. So depiction of female figures coming out of the Greek world. And I say Greek world because the name for the Greeks really doesn't sort of show up until actually pretty late in the history of peoples living in this part of the world. So our earliest figures in the 3rd millennium, you see at the bottom, also remember stylized versus abstract. So this is also part of the kind of European genealogy of the field, is that in Greek art, there is a very discernible move from more abstracted stylized figures to more realistic figures at the end of the story. So by the 4th century BCE, you have a female figure with pretty realistic proportions. If you had a close up, the fabric and her hair would have to the right amounts of asymmetry and so forth. And actually, maybe from the 3 in the middle, you can kind of already get a sense of why I mentioned Egypt as the sort of origins or early, actually the 705-30. Anyway, okay, so that's diachronic, and actually that's what we're really doing in the class, is looking at sort of changes over time. And this is really the easiest way to get just a bigger picture, get you into the material as a student. And then when you want to become a specialist, that's when you start doing things that are more narrow and small. So I'll try to do some synchronic stuff because I think this is part of the work of getting classics out of its Eurocentric and sort of narratives and also white supremacist narratives that devalue Egypt and Africa. Because synchronic studies give us a good sense of contact, basically, between cultures, and hopefully with that sort of dismantles this idea of Greece as being somehow special and unique, which is not, of course, to devalue any of the achievements or structures or anything, but rather just to look at our world as a globe versus isolated places. So my example for our synchronic study and what we'll talk about a little bit in class, I have a couple of Egyptian works that I'm showing you. And these are all, and then also Mesopotamian, and then early Greek, and these are all from the 2nd millennium BCE, which is a huge amount of time, of course. But when we talk about ancient cultures, we often will deal with these big stretches of time. And this is goes back to the nature of history, and that in the 2nd millennium BCE, Amenhotep III, who's the statue that you see here, he's not concerned with building history the way we have it. The orders of the pharaohs and other ways of record keeping and identity were more important there. So synchronic studies, more so what we're doing day to day, but diachronic is the overall picture. All right, so the next video we'll start out with the earliest Egyptian art that I'm going to show you, the Palettes of Narmer. Let's get ready. It'll be exciting.